Rick and Morty built its reputation as the smartest, darkest animated show of its era. Millions made it appointment television. But the show began as a crude short in which a child was pressured into a sexual act. That short became the series. This is every disturbing fact about Rick and Morty. The origin, nobody mentions. In 2006, Justin Roiland was in trouble with Bill Cosby's lawyers. He had been making animated shorts for Channel 101, the short film festival in Los Angeles that Dan Harmon had co-founded. And one of his recurring projects was a series called House of Cosbys, which featured cartoon versions of the comedian multiplying and causing chaos. The lawyers sent a cease and desist letter. The show was dead. And Roiland, by his own account, decided to respond by making something so deliberately offensive that no corporation in its right mind would ever want to claim legal ownership of it. The result was The Real Animated Adventures of Doc and Marty, a crude animated short built around thinly disguised versions of Doc Brown and Marty McFly from Back to the Future. The plot, such as it was, centered on a young character named Marty McDonald's being urged by the older scientist Doc Smith to take part in a deeply inappropriate act in order to solve the problem of the moment and, eventually, travel through time. Harmon, who would become Roiland's creative partner and the show's co-creator, later described the short as a bastardization and a highly explicit vandalization of the source material it drew from. The audience at Channel 101 reacted wildly, which, at that festival, could mean anything from confused appreciation to genuine shock. Nevertheless, Harmon took a liking to what Roiland was doing, and that reaction would eventually put one of the most beloved animated series of the 21st century into motion. The names of the characters had been changed specifically to sidestep intellectual property law. Roiland was already familiar with how quickly studios could move when they felt their property was being used without permission, and the lesson of House of Cosbys was fresh. So Doc Brown became Doc Smith, Marty McFly became Marty McDonald's, and the visual references to the original film were deliberately muddled enough to create legal distance. The protest was built into the architecture of the short from the start. Roiland later described the whole project as an exercise in trolling, a conscious attempt to create something so transgressive that the very nature of the content would keep it safe from corporate legal action. No studio, the logic went, would want to publicly claim that the offensive animated short featuring their beloved characters owed them royalties. The strategy worked, though perhaps not in the way Roiland had originally intended. Something unexpected happened while he was editing the audio. Roiland had voiced both characters himself, improvising dialogue in the recording booth, and as he sat with the material, he found himself growing attached to the voices he had created. The characters, stripped of the specific provocation they had been designed to deliver, had a texture he wanted to keep exploring. The dynamic between an eccentric older figure and a nervous younger one all bravado and questionable judgment, the other genuinely frightened but unable to walk away, felt like it had room inside it for something more sustained than a single gross-out gag. He continued making shorts featuring Doc Smith and Marty across the following years, creating close to 15 minutes of total material, each installment moving further from the Back to the Future reference point and closer to its own identity. The characters were becoming something, even if nobody outside a small circle of Channel 101 regulars knew that yet. For several years, that was the full extent of it. Roiland was working in voice acting, doing work for Disney and Cartoon Network, and Harmon had gone on to create and run Community, the NBC sitcom that would define his public reputation. The two had stayed in contact after their Channel 101 collaboration, and Harmon had built a genuine appreciation for Roiland's particular brand of humor, the kind that shoved its shock value so far past propriety that it circled back around to something oddly sincere underneath the offense. Then, in 2012, Harmon was fired from Community in a dispute with the studio, a removal that shook his career and left him briefly without a project. Adult Swim, the late-night programming block on Cartoon Network that had cultivated a reputation for experimental and deliberately strange adult comedy, approached him shortly afterward. They were looking for something that could function as a more mainstream hit, and they thought Harmon might be the person to provide it. Harmon was initially uncertain whether Adult Swim was the right environment for his style, and by his own admission, he was not especially comfortable with animation as a format. His process centered on character, dialogue, and story structure in ways that mapped more naturally onto live action. But rather than develop something from scratch, he called Roiland, knowing that his collaborator had been sitting on something with potential. Roiland immediately brought up the Doc and Marty characters, and the pitch meeting that followed moved quickly. The two characters would be renamed, their ages and relationships adjusted, and the most explicit content from the original short would be left entirely behind. Doc Smith became Rick Sanchez. Marty became Morty Smith, now established explicitly as Rick's teenage grandson rather than an ambiguous young companion. The relationship between them was the same engine under the hood, an older figure of enormous capability and questionable ethics, pulling a younger one into situations that neither had fully thought through. But the premise was now dressed for a family structure rather than a crude parody. The first draft of the pilot was completed in 6 hours, written in Harmon's unfurnished office on the Paramount lot, the room still empty from his abrupt exit from Community. The speed of its creation became part of the show's mythology, a detail that suggested the two creators had so much built-up material and shared instinct that the actual writing was almost a formality after all the years of development. But the path from that draft to the television screen nearly ended at a single early hurdle. An Adult Swim executive listened to the pilot and told Harmon and Roiland that he did not like the character of Morty, which the pair interpreted as a suggestion that they should recast the role with a different voice actor. Roiland had always voiced both characters himself, and his ability to perform both sides of their dynamic in real time during improvised recording sessions was central to how the show functioned. The prospect of splitting those two voices apart filled both creators with something close to panic, and they actually began auditioning other actors before Roiland produced a revised take on the character that satisfied the network. The near miss became one of the show's foundational production stories, something the creators later described as both the worst crisis in the show's development and the most important puzzle piece falling into place. Roiland, throughout this entire period, was quietly terrified about one specific thing. The original Doc and Marty short still existed. It was available in various forms, the original version in particular featuring imagery explicit enough that an edited version uploaded to the show's own official YouTube channel in April 2019 was eventually removed for violating the platform's terms of service. Roiland had not shown the short to the producers at Adult Swim. He was worried, as season 1 was being made, that they might stumble across it, and that the discovery would complicate or end the whole arrangement. The original short was never presented to the network as part of the pitch. The characters' origins were, by design, kept at a distance from the conversations happening in development meetings. What the executives were being sold was Rick and Morty, a show about an eccentric genius scientist and his teenage grandson navigating family life and interdimensional adventure. What they were not being walked through was the unedited creative lineage of those characters back to a deliberate act of transgressive protest art featuring child sexual content. The format of the show was shaped by negotiations between Roiland's instincts and Adult Swim's requirements. Roiland had originally wanted the show to run as 11-minute segments, which would have given it a looser, more sketch-like structure. The network pushed for a full half-hour program. Harmon then argued that the best way to extend the two central voices into that runtime was to build an entire family around them, giving the show a domestic anchor that would let the wilder, interdimensional adventures contrast against something recognizable and grounded. Nick Weidenfeld, the Adult Swim development executive working on the project, contributed the suggestion that would define the whole premise. Rick should be Morty's grandfather, not simply his mentor or partner. That single structural decision changed the show's emotional center entirely. The relationship between an old man and a teenager is different from the relationship between a mentor and an apprentice, and the specific weight of a grandparent-grandchild bond, the love that runs through it alongside the age gap and the power imbalance, gave the show a core it could return to, no matter how far the plots traveled from suburbia. What makes the origin story genuinely disturbing, rather than merely interesting, is not any single element of it in isolation. The offensive nature of the Doc and Marty short is not, by itself, unusual territory for avant-garde or transgressive animation. The use of crude shock content as protest art has a long history, and Roiland's original intent was to use offensiveness as a kind of legal shield, rather than a genuine artistic position. The show that emerged from it is, by any reasonable measure, something far more sophisticated than its starting point. The discomfort comes from the layering. The short that seeded the show featured a young character being pressured into a deeply inappropriate situation by an older authority figure. The show that grew from it centers on a relationship between an old man and his teenage grandson, in which the teenager is routinely manipulated, endangered, emotionally affected, and used as cover for his companion's more dangerous activities. The show is aware of this dynamic and examines it critically over multiple seasons, which is different from endorsing it. The point is that the examination is built on a foundation that most people watching the series never think about, because the production kept the foundation carefully out of sight. The references that did make it into the show confirm that Roiland was not entirely willing to disown the origin. The season 2 period saw subtle callbacks beginning to appear, small visual details and plot elements that functioned as acknowledgments of where the characters had started. The season 5 premiere included a scene from the original short displayed on a crystal in the cold opening, a moment that fans familiar with the material recognized immediately, and that passed over the heads of the majority of the audience who had no reason to know it was there. Doc Smith and Marty Marty McDonald's were at one point planned to appear as members of the Council of Ricks, a gathering that, by that point in the series, had become a vehicle for exploring what infinite variation did to a single identity. The appearance fell through in the final production, but the intent was there, the inclination to acknowledge where the characters had come from and what they had been before they became the versions the world knew. The House of Cosby's footnote acquired a particular retrospective irony after 2018, when the comedian, whose lawyers had sent Roiland the cease and desist letters, was convicted of aggravated indecent assault, then released on appeal in 2021. The short that became the seed of Rick and Morty was created as a protest against the legal aggression of a man whose own conduct toward women would later become a matter of public record and criminal prosecution. The history of the show's creation is, looked at from far enough back, a tangle of people behaving badly in various ways and directions, and the artistic product that emerged from that tangle went on to be watched by tens of millions of people who had no idea any of it had happened. The clean version of the origin story, which is the one most fans know, goes something like this. Two talented creators met at a film festival, developed a relationship, and eventually pitched a show to a network at exactly the right moment. And the show they made was brilliant enough to capture a generation's attention. That version is true in its broad outlines, and incomplete in ways that matter. The show came from somewhere specific, and the somewhere specific is stranger and darker than the version on the poster suggests. Rick Sanchez exists because Justin Roiland wanted to make something too offensive to sue, fell in love with a voice he created while doing it, and spent years carrying that voice through different projects until a network handed him the resources to build a world around it. The world he built is genuinely remarkable. The ground it was built on is not what the merchandise implies. Understanding the origin does not change what the show is. It does change the shape of the question the show keeps asking about the gap between what something appears to be and what it actually is. Because the show itself was assembled on exactly that gap. A beloved mainstream animated series whose creative DNA traces back to a crude protest film its own producers were never meant to see. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The origin established the show's founding contradiction, a piece of deliberate transgression that became something genuinely beloved, its darkest roots carefully kept out of sight. Next, the focus turns to what that show did to the character at the center of it, and the full weight of what Morty Smith actually survived across the run. Section 2. What the show does to Morty. Summer Smith has one of the stranger lines in the whole series, delivered early in the run with the casualness of someone stating the weather. She tells Morty that their grandfather is going to get him killed one day. She says it the way you would say that a leaky faucet was eventually going to cause a problem, something acknowledged and accepted rather than alarming. The line gets a small reaction, and the episode moves on. But the show keeps returning to the question underneath it for 8 seasons, and by the time it has accumulated its answer, the cumulative record of what Morty Smith actually experienced over the course of the series is one of the more quietly disturbing portraits in all of adult animation. The relationship between Rick and Morty is sold, in the show's framing and in most fan discussion, as a complicated but genuine bond between a grandfather and his grandson. That description is accurate. The show earns the emotional weight of that bond through years of careful writing, and by the later seasons, the connection between these two characters is the emotional core the entire series orbits around. Holding that truth alongside the documented record of what Rick does to Morty and what Morty survives is the exercise the show keeps quietly demanding, and the record is worth laying out in full because the tendency to absorb each season's new trauma into the show's general darkness means that very few people ever look at all of it at once. The first season establishes the terms. Before the second episode is finished, Morty has been shot. Before the 6th episode airs, he has been through something that the show frames carefully and that the later creative team confirmed was an attempted assault in a bathroom stall, a scene that will get its full examination in a later section of this video. The show puts a 14-year-old through the experience, and then, in a structural decision that deserves attention, does not center the aftermath. Morty walks out of that bathroom and carries it silently for the rest of the episode, and what the audience watches is Rick intuiting what happened from context and then quietly exacting revenge rather than any form of genuine support or processing. The boy goes home, the season continues, the trauma gets filed. Then comes the episode that changes everything about how the show should be understood from that point forward. Rick Potion number 9 is the 6th episode of the first season, and it ends with a 14-year-old child digging a grave in the backyard of someone else's house and lowering his own dead body into it. The show does not cut away from this. Morty kneels over the corpse of the version of himself who died in a lab accident and the reality the two of them have just moved into, and the camera holds on his face while he processes what he is doing, which is burying himself so that he can take over the life of the dead version, and no one around him will notice the switch. Rick, standing nearby with a shovel, does not offer much beyond the practical. The two of them fill in the grave, the scene ends, the episode ends, the season continues. The consequence of that scene is the home the show lives in for the rest of its run. From that moment forward, the Smith family the audience follows is not the original. Beth, Jerry, Summer, the house, the town, none of them are the people and places the series began with. The original Morty's family is still out in some other reality, presumably grieving a son and brother who never came home. The replacement Morty lives in their space and answers to their names, and tries not to think about the bodies in the backyard. The show returns to the weight of this decision repeatedly across later seasons, treating it as the defining wound of Morty's interior life, the thing that changed him from an anxious kid into something more armored. The memory erasure device compounds this in ways that are easy to underestimate because the show treats the device as dark comedy rather than horror. Rick keeps a collection of Morty's erased memories in a room, small vials of removed experience that he uses as insurance against a grandson who might otherwise become too difficult to manage. The episode Morty's Mind Blowers, in the third season, opens that room and walks the audience through a selection of what is stored there. And what the vials contain is a curated record of the worst things Morty has seen and done, each experience deemed by Rick to be too damaging for the boy to carry consciously. The logic the show presents is that Rick is doing Morty a kindness by removing these memories. The logic the show also presents, without making a speech about it, is that a man who keeps a private collection of his grandson's traumatic memories in a locked room, available for his own reference at any time, is doing something that does not entirely map on to kindness. The device also means that Morty's sense of his own history is fundamentally unreliable. He knows things have been taken from him. He does not know what they were or how many there were. The room suggests that the number is significant. He moves through the world carrying a self that has been edited by someone else, shaped by removals he did not consent to. And the question of who Morty actually is underneath those edits is one the show raises and then declines to fully answer, because answering it would require acknowledging the scope of what was done. A child who has had his worst experiences systematically removed is a child whose capacity to understand his own responses to the world has been deliberately compromised, which is a fairly precise description of a specific category of harm, and the show stages this as a recurring dark joke, while also, over multiple seasons, depicting its consequences in Morty's behavior. The thing that the show establishes about the Morty-Rick dynamic in its very first season, and that most discussions of the series treat as a piece of world building rather than an indictment, is the most clinical fact in the whole arrangement. The episode, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, explains that a Morty's underdeveloped brainwaves generate a field of neural interference that masks a Rick's distinctive mental signature, making the pair together much harder to detect by the tracking technologies that various hostile forces use to hunt Ricks across the multiverse. Stripped of sentiment, the show has just told the audience that the primary functional reason a Rick travels with a Morty is that the child makes effective cover. The grandson is not a companion in the sense that implies voluntary mutual regard. At the baseline level, before the emotional complexity of their specific relationship is factored in, Morty is camouflage. He is a cloaking device that happens to love the person hiding behind him. The show does not present this as the whole story, and it would be a distortion to treat it as such. The series is equally honest that Rick genuinely cares about this specific Morty, and it earns that care through years of episodes that demonstrate it in action. The point is not that the relationship is empty, but that it was built on a calculation, and the calculation was made before the relationship existed in any meaningful sense. Rick arrived at his daughter's house with a strategic need for a specific kind of companion, and found one available and already inclined to love him. The emotional bond that grew from that is real. The circumstances that produced it are something else. By the third season, the accumulation of what Morty has survived begins to show up in his behavior in ways the show makes explicit rather than merely implicit. The episode Rest and Ricklaxation, in which Rick and Morty are split into healthy and toxic versions of themselves at an alien spa, depicts a Morty without his toxic traits, who has become, in Rick's words, a full sociopath, because the traits the detox removed include the guilt and anxiety and self-doubt that had been functioning as the primary checks on his behavior. Non-toxic Morty, freed from his damage, turns out to be charming, confident, and completely indifferent to other people's well-being in ways that disturb even Rick. The implication is that the anxiety and guilt that make Morty's life difficult are also the things that make him Morty, rather than something colder, and that the adventures with Rick have spent those traits down in ways that are not not being replenished. The fourth season makes this trajectory explicit. An early episode has Morty in possession of a death crystal, a gemstone that lets the holder see every possible manner of their own death branching out from each decision they make, and he becomes addicted to steering his choices toward one specific future death, a death beside the girl he has loved since the beginning of the series. The addiction produces increasingly erratic and dangerous behavior, and at one point Morty drives a car through a crowd while checking his crystal for the optimal routing. He injures and possibly kills people, and the show is deliberate about showing that Morty does not stop to process this, simply checks the crystal again and adjusts his trajectory. The episode ends with Rick intervening, which is itself a reversal of the usual dynamic, and the moment is played as both funny and genuinely unsettling. A kid who has seen too much death has developed a parasocial relationship with his own future dying, and the show frames this as the logical endpoint of the life he has been living. The most pointed articulation of what the show has done to Morty comes in the fifth season episode Rick-Dependent Spraying, and then more thoroughly in the fifth season finale, where the cumulative effect of the adventures is addressed directly in the narrative. Morty, by this point, has developed a fluency with violence, a capacity for strategic thinking under pressure, and a willingness to escalate situations that would have horrified the boy in the pilot. The show acknowledges this as something produced by his experiences rather than innate, which is important because innate darkness would be a different story. The darkness in Morty is imported, shaped by years of being told implicitly and occasionally explicitly that this is what surviving in Rick's world requires. The show's most honest examination of the whole dynamic comes through Summer, who observes it from close range for long enough to draw accurate conclusions. Summer is sharper than either Rick or Morty generally gives her credit for, and by the later seasons she has become something that the show treats as both admirable and concerning, a version of what Morty could have become if he had been the one chosen for the adventures. Her arc in the third season, where she accompanies Rick on several missions and acquires the same comfortable relationship with violence that Morty has, is staged quickly enough that the speed itself is the statement. It does not take long to get there. The world Rick takes people into accelerates things. The hardening arc, which is the through line running from the anxious boy burying his own body in the backyard to the later Morty who can process a car accident involving multiple casualties while checking a death crystal, is the show's most patient piece of character work. It unfolds across years rather than episodes, which makes it easy to absorb season by season without registering the full distance traveled. Laid end to end, what the show depicts is a child who began the series frightened of almost everything and ended it, seasons later, frightened of very little, not because he has healed or grown in the conventional sense, but because the threshold of what registers as alarming has simply been raised so many times that ordinary fear has been burned out of him. The show knows this and says so. The most precise diagnosis in the whole run comes from an unexpected direction, in a scene that takes place not during an adventure, but in a therapist's office, which is itself the statement the show is making about where this subject actually belongs. When the family is briefly required to attend sessions with a therapist named Dr. Wong in the Pickle Rick episode, the therapist's observations land on the entire family dynamic rather than on one member of it, and what she says about how the family uses intelligence to justify avoiding the work of feeling is as applicable to what has been done to Morty as it is to Rick's choices. The difference is that Rick makes choices. Morty, at 14, is subject to them. The Cronenbergs, the microverse labor, the death crystals, the memory erasures, and the bathroom in the fantasy world are all individual episodes of the accumulation. The more important fact is the accumulation itself, the way the show constructs a record of trauma and then watches what that record does to a person over time, with enough honesty to show the changes without editorializing too heavily about whether they are good or bad. The boy who carried his dead self to a grave in the first season and the young man checking a death crystal on a car ride in the fourth are the same character, connected by years of exactly the kind of experience the show sold as adventure. The show's willingness to show what adventure costs without softening the invoice is one of the things that separates it from other series in its genre. It is also, when you read the full bill, one of the more quietly devastating portraits of what happens to a child who spends his formative years in the wrong person's care. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 2 traced the full arc of what the series puts Morty through, the accumulation of a record that most people absorb season by season rather than all at once. Next, the focus turns to the single most disturbing scene in the show's run, a scene from the very first season that the audience audience was never supposed to be comfortable with, and what the post-credits moment that follows it quietly reveals about the world the show is set in. Section 3. The bathroom in the fantasy world. The 5th episode of the first season of Rick and Morty has a silly premise. Morty, tired of Rick's habit of choosing all their adventures without consulting him, makes a bet. He gets to pick one adventure, something simple and fun, and if he gives up before it is finished, he has to stop complaining about future adventures for a set period of time. Rick agrees. Morty picks a fairy tale world, the kind with a beanstalk and a giant and a village of creatures that need saving. And the episode splits its attention between that storyline and a separate plot back home, where Jerry's disastrous attempt to improve his golf game with a Meeseeks box spirals into increasingly dangerous chaos. The adventure half of the episode is played as gentle comedy. A giant gets killed, a trial follows, the pair win on a technicality, and they stop into a tavern to celebrate before heading back through the portal. The show's tone up to that point in the episode is light. Then Morty goes to the bathroom. King Jellybean, the beloved and celebrated ruler of the village the pair have just saved, is standing at the sink when Morty enters. The character's design is soft and cartoonish, a large, round, anthropomorphic jelly bean with a kind face and a regal cape, the visual language of friendly children's media. He offers Morty comfort and congratulations for completing the adventure. Then, over the course of a scene that runs significantly longer than the show's average gag, his demeanor shifts. He corners Morty in a stall. He becomes physically aggressive. He tells the boy to just go with the flow. He licks him. He grabs him. Morty fights back, slamming the character's head against a toilet seat repeatedly in a burst of terrified adrenaline, and then runs out of the bathroom, visibly shaking, his face rearranged into something the show's animation is careful to depict as genuine shock, rather than the rubbery cartoon distress that most animated series use for comedic effect. The scene was not played for laughs. This is the critical design decision, and the one that every serious discussion of the moment has to begin with. The show could have framed the attempted assault as an absurdist gag, leaning into the inherent ridiculousness of a villain who is literally a talking candy confection to create the kind of tonal distance that makes difficult material easier to process. It did not do that. The animation team and the director made the deliberate choice to stage the bathroom scene as horror rather than comedy, using realistic body language and genuine distress signals rather than cartoon shorthand. Morty's reaction is drawn as a 14-year-old boy's actual response to an actual assault attempt. The joke, such as it is, comes from the visual contrast of King Jellybean's design rather than from anything about what he is doing, and that contrast functions to make the scene more unsettling rather than less. Ryan Ridley, who wrote the episode, later addressed the scene directly in a Reddit comment, confirming what the visual choices had already made clear. The show intended King Jellybean's behavior to be read as a genuine attempt at highly inappropriate conduct. He had a documented history of deeply inappropriate behavior. The friendly authority figure design was not a coincidence, but a point. The creature who almost subjected Morty to a deeply disturbing encounter in a bathroom was beloved by his community, trusted by his people, and walking around in the visual language of something harmless. The episode was drawing a deliberate portrait of how manipulative behavior operates behind a reassuring surface, and it wanted the audience to sit with the reality of the incident rather than be permitted to laugh it away. Rick, outside, pieces together what happened when he sees King Jellybean emerge from the bathroom with his face swollen from Morty's counterattack. He says nothing to Morty about it directly. He does not ask. He adjusts the plan around the information, persuades Morty to see the adventure through to its conclusion so the boy can take the win rather than the loss. And as the pair leave through the portal, Rick's arm reaches back through the closing door with a weapon and shoots King Jellybean dead in front of his entire celebrating village. The act is Rick's acknowledgement, made through action rather than language, that something happened in that bathroom that he will not tolerate going unanswered. He never confirms this to Morty. He never brings it up. The revenge is done, and the portal closes and they go home. If the episode had ended there, it would already be one of the most pointed moments in the show's first season. But the post-credit scene takes what has already happened and extends its implications outward in a way that makes the whole thing significantly more disturbing. Two of the villagers go to King Jellybean's home following his death and discover a box of photographs. The show does not show the contents of the box. It shows the reaction of the characters who look inside, which is enough. The official's response is disgust. There is a long pause. Then the decision is made. The photographs will be destroyed. King Jellybean's public image, the statues, the legacy, the beloved memory the village has of its ruler will remain intact. The community will get more from the idea he represented than from the truth of what he actually was. The evidence burns. The episode ends. The post-credit scene is doing something that the adventure portion of the episode has set up but not fully articulated. The show is not only depicting an assault attempt, it is depicting depicting the institutional response to evidence of a predator's history, a response in which the people in a position to expose the truth make the calculation that protecting the community's good feeling about its own history is worth more than the harm that comes from burial. The photographs are the record of prior victims. Their destruction is the protection of the powerful at the expense of the already harmed. The village goes on celebrating a king's memory that it chose to preserve knowing it was false, and the episode cuts to black. Justin Roiland addressed the scene publicly not long after the episode aired. His statement acknowledged that some viewers had found the material distressing, and he directed his words at those who had been personally affected by similar experiences in their own lives. He made clear that the scene was deliberate, that it was meant to be realistic and gritty and horrible, and that the show was dark in ways that might not be suitable for all viewers. He asked for understanding from those who had been affected. The statement was notable for what it confirmed about the intent, that the scene was not an accident of tone or a miscalculation of register, but a considered choice to depict something serious in a serious way inside a show that often operated in a far lighter register. The show wanted the audience to be disturbed. It had succeeded. What the episode was drawing from is worth naming, because the post-credit scene in particular is not generating its horror from nowhere. The structure of a beloved community figure whose predatory history is buried to protect institutional reputation is not a fairy tale invention. It is the documented pattern of how real institutions have responded to real abuse throughout recorded history, in schools, in religious communities, in entertainment and sports and government, in any structure organized around the reputation of its central figures rather than the safety of the people within it. The village's decision to burn the photographs and preserve the statue is a children's fairy tale version of a mechanism that real victims in the real world had been trying to get the world to recognize for decades before this episode aired. The show put that mechanism in a cartoon about a talking jelly bean and trusted the audience to feel the weight of it through the comedy's skin. The creative team at Rick and Morty would later describe the episode's stance on assault more broadly as one of the show's early demonstrations of where it drew its own lines. The same episode that featured a running gag about Mr. Meeseeks escalating toward violence over a golf handicap also contained what the writers openly described as an unflinching look at the reality of what a sexual assault on a minor actually looks and feels like. TV Tropes, in its documentation of the episode, described this as the show establishing its position that comments about assault can be part of comedy, but the act itself is not a joke, and that the episode was a series-establishing moment for this stance. Rick, earlier in the same episode, makes a crude remark about what awaits criminals in prison. That line is played as a throwaway gag. The bathroom is staged as horror. The distinction is intentional. Then, years later, the retrospective reading arrived. In January 2023, Justin Roiland, the man who co-created King Jellybean and who had publicly confirmed the character's predatory intent, was reported to be facing felony domestic violence charges. Adult Swim ended its association with him. In September of the same year, after those charges had been dropped for insufficient evidence, an investigative report by NBC News detailed accounts from 11 women and non-binary people who described a pattern of Roiland using his platform and celebrity to make contact with fans, some of whom were as young as 16 at the time the communications began. 3 of those people described Roiland initiating contact when they were minors. Multiple accounts described conversations that were shifted towards sexual content. One woman described an alleged assault. Roiland's representatives denied the most serious allegations. He has maintained his innocence. No criminal charges arose from the NBC investigation. The show that Roiland created and publicly championed contains a scene from its very first season in which a beloved and trusted authority figure with a kind public face uses that face to corner a teenage boy in a private space and attempts to assault him. The show's post-credit scene depicts the institutional decision to protect that figure's legacy by burning evidence of his history. The show's creator stated publicly that the scene was meant to be realistic and horrible, and that the depiction of the assault was deliberate rather than accidental. What the audience is left with, given everything that subsequently emerged about Roiland, is a question that has no clean answer, and that the show itself cannot resolve because it was made before the public record existed. Did the scene reflect something the creator understood about this particular category of harm from his own behavior? Was it a coincidence between a fictional narrative choice and a real pattern of conduct that emerged years later? Did the episode's honesty about how predatory figures use trusted appearances simply reflect a general understanding of how these things work, or was there something more specific underneath it? The answer to those questions is not available. The charges against Roiland that went to court were dropped. The NBC investigation investigation produced allegations rather than charges. The legal record does not supply a verdict, and the creative record does not supply an explanation. What can be said is that the scene exists, that it was made by specific people with specific intentions, and that reading those intentions through the lens of what subsequently became public about one of those people is something every viewer does or declines to do individually. The episode remains one of the most deliberately uncomfortable single sequences in the show's run, produced with unusual care and seriousness for a show that operated primarily in comedy, and the discomfort has only deepened in the years since it aired. The episode also establishes something about how the show would continue to handle Morty's experiences that the bathroom scene makes visible in retrospect. Morty does not get to process what happened in that bathroom. The episode moves on. The adventure concludes. The win is counted. Rick's revenge is silent and completed without discussion, and the pair go home and the season continues. The trauma is filed, as it would continue to be filed, season after season, in the locked room of Morty's edited memory. Somewhere in the vials stored in that room, across the later seasons, there is presumably the clear version of what happened in the Thirsty Step Tavern's bathroom in a medieval fairy tale world, sitting alongside the other things Rick determined were too heavy for the boy to carry. The show never confirms this. It doesn't have to. The logic of the memory room and the logic of the bathroom scene are the same logic, and the show built both of them into the same first season, and the relationship between them is not accidental. The King Jellybean scene is the most discussed single moment of darkness in the show's first season, and arguably in the entire run. It earned that position by refusing to be comfortable, by staging something serious as something serious inside a show that could have gotten away with staging it as something else, and by extending its implications into a post-credit sequence that moved the whole thing from a story about one character's experience into a story about institutions and silence and the decisions communities make when the truth is too expensive for them. The show put all of that into the 5th episode of its first season, before most of its audience had any idea what kind of show they were watching. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 3 examined the show's most deliberately disturbing single scene, and the retrospective questions its existence raises about the people who made it. Next, the focus widens from one episode to the pattern running through the whole series, the show's consistent habit of packaging genuinely horrifying ethical events as comedy, and what happens when you stop laughing long enough to look at the math. Section 4. The crimes played as comedy. There is a scene in the 6th episode of the first season where Rick stands in a backyard with a shovel and explains the situation to his grandson with the calm of a man describing a plumbing problem. The planet is ruined. He ruined it. He cannot fix it. The science that he applied with complete confidence to a request Morty made about a girl at a school dance has spread through the global flu virus and converted the entire human population of Earth into grotesque, mutated creatures, and then mutated those creatures again into something worse. And the smartest man in the universe has run the numbers and concluded that there is no solution available to him. So the plan is to portal to a parallel timeline where a version of the two of them has just died in a lab accident, bury those versions in the backyard, and step into the dead men's lives. Simple, practical, done. The Cronenberg episode, as the fandom calls it, is the show's first full demonstration of a technique it will use for the rest of its run. The technique is to take an event of genuinely staggering moral weight, something that in a different context would anchor the entire dramatic architecture of a serious work of fiction, and deliver it at the rhythm of a punchline. The planet is destroyed. 7 billion people are permanently transformed into monsters. Morty's original family is left behind in a ruined world without him. The show registers all of this, pauses for exactly as long as the laugh needs, and moves on. The next episode, Rick is building something in the garage. Life, in a different borrowed timeline, continues. Understanding what the show is doing with this technique is the difference between reading it as nihilism and reading it as something more complicated than nihilism. The show is not pretending the Cronenberg event was fine. The animation team took care to make Morty's face during the burial scene look like a child who is doing something that will never leave him. The episode is genuinely affecting in its final minutes precisely because it refuses to let the audience laugh all the way through. But the technique is still the technique, and across 8 seasons, the show applies it to events of escalating ethical scale, packaging them in the wrapper of comedy, and watching how much the audience will absorb before the discomfort of what is actually happening breaks through the laughter. The Meeseeks box is the cleanest early example of the technique operating on a smaller scale. Rick presents the device to his family in the episode Me Seeks and Destroy with minimal explanation. function. Press the button, a blue creature appears, it will complete one task, then it will cease to exist. The show plays this as a domestic convenience joke, the kind of gadget a sitcom family might receive and immediately misuse. Beth and Summer understand the limitations and make simple requests. Jerry asks for help with his golf game. The Meeseeks assigned to Jerry cannot complete the task because the task is too difficult, which means they cannot die, which means they continue existing in what the episode makes clear is a state of prolonged suffering. They describe their own existence as agony. They multiply and panic and eventually turn violent. The comedy of the episode is real. The Meeseeks scenario is genuinely funny in the way escalating absurdity is funny, a golf handicap producing an existential crisis among an army of blue men. But the episode is also presenting the following factual premise without comment. Rick Sanchez has solved the creation of sentient, self-aware life. He has bottled it. He sells it, or at the very least distributes it casually, as a labor-saving device. The beings he creates are conscious, and they suffer. Their suffering is a design feature rather than a flaw, a deliberate parameter built into a gadget meant to make chores easier. The device works exactly as intended. The horror is precisely that it works. If the Meeseeks establishes the pattern at the level of a household appliance, the Ricks must be crazy expands it to the size of a civilization. When the car battery dies in the second season, Rick explains that the battery is powered by a complete miniature universe he created and populated with intelligent life. The civilization inside the microverse has developed technology, culture, governance, and a conception of their own world that does not include the information that they are being farmed. The energy they generate through their daily industry powers Rick's car. They believe the technology that produces this energy is a gift from a great inventor who came among them long ago. That inventor was Rick. He sold them the technology as philanthropy while quietly routing its output to his battery. Every microverse resident who has ever worked, built, or lived has done so inside a container that exists to serve as a power source for a vehicle belonging to a drunk man in another reality. The episode then folds this premise inward on itself. Zeep, the greatest scientist in the microverse, has independently invented the same trick, building his own miniature universe to power his world, and inside that nested universe, another scientist has built a third. Each layer is a replica of the same exploitation. Each genius certain he stands at the summit and unaware of the larger hand wrapped around his entire sky. Rick, confronted with this information, does not appear troubled by it. He is annoyed that Zeep has figured out the same technique, and the two of them have a conflict that the episode plays as a buddy comedy, in which the ethical dimension of what both of them have done is present as backdrop rather than subject. The show trusts the audience to register what is in the frame. It does not underline it. Anatomy Park takes the technique into territory that is specifically about the exploitation of a vulnerable person, rather than an invented civilization. Rick has built a theme park inside the body of a man named Ruben, a homeless individual he apparently befriended or encountered and subsequently used as a biological facility without Ruben's meaningful consent or any indication that Ruben received compensation for the use of his internal organs as tourist infrastructure. The episode plays the interior of Ruben's body as an adventure setting, complete with attractions themed around its various systems. Ruben himself is sick, dying in the real world outside, while the adventure proceeds inside him. He dies before the episode ends, and the show treats his death as a plot event that changes the conditions of the adventure rather than a human loss with weight attached to it. The park, when Ruben's body fails, expands to enormous size and becomes briefly visible from space before being destroyed. Ruben had a name. He is referred to by name throughout the episode. The show knows he was a person. It stages his existence and his death in the register of comedy, which is the technique doing its work, and the comedy works because animation and absurdity and the pace of the plot create the same distance that makes other difficult things in the show survivable as entertainment. The question the technique keeps raising, which it never answers because answering it would require stopping the episode, is what it means that this is the comedy. A person's death is the joke. The exploitation of that person's body is the premise. The laugh is available and genuine and built on something that, removed from the animation and the timing and the voice performances, is a story about a man being used without his consent until he dies. The Mortiplicity episode in the 5th season is where the technique scales to its most structurally complex expression. Rick has seeded his life with an unknown number of duplicate families, copies of Beth and Jerry and Summer and Morty, placed in identical houses and equipped with complete memories of a life they did not live, each one believing itself to be the real family and existing primarily to absorb any attack intended for the genuine article. The episode becomes a farce of escalating violence as duplicate family after duplicate family discovers the situation and turns on the others, and the comedy is technically impressive, the kind of elaborate structural joke that rewards attention and generates genuine laughter through its own internal logic. The setup requires the following to be true. Rick created multiple, conscious, fully realized versions of his own family members. He gave each of them complete inner lives, relationships, and the experience of being real. He did this knowing that their primary function was to die in his place. He has no reliable way of knowing which family is the original, which the episode eventually confirms, and has apparently made peace with this uncertainty. The copies are not empty shells or simple automatons. The episode gives the duplicates enough interiority that the audience can feel something when they die, which is the only way the escalating body count generates any emotion beyond neutral amusement. Rick made people. He made them to be sacrificed. He made enough of them that even he cannot identify which version of his own family is the one that matters to him. The show packages this as farce, and the farce is genuinely funny, which is the technique working as designed, and the reason it is worth examining with care. The memory erasure device, which the Morty's Mind Blowers episode examines most directly, belongs to the same catalog of crimes played as comedy. Rick keeps a private archive of Morty's worst experiences, removed without consistent consent, and stored for his own reference in a locked room. The episode opens this room as the premise for a series of dark vignettes, each one a brief comedy sketch built from something Morty had to have erased because it was too damaging to carry. The format works because each individual segment is self-contained and often absurd. The format also means that the audience is watching a sustained demonstration of how many times a grandfather has made the decision to reach into his grandson's memory and remove something without asking whether Morty wanted to keep it. The number is not small. The room contains a significant archive. What makes the memory erasure sit differently from other dark content in the show is the power dynamic it clarifies. Rick decides what gets removed. Rick decides what stays. Morty's self-knowledge is a product of Rick's editorial choices, which means that every time Morty asserts anything about who he is or how he has changed, the assertion is built on a foundation that someone else shaped without his awareness. The comedy of the episode is real, but the premise underneath it is a description of a relationship in which one party has been systematically managed rather than genuinely known, in which the holder of the greater power has continuously made decisions about what the lesser party is allowed to remember about their own life. The Look Who's Purging Now episode handles violence with the same technique, this time letting Morty be the one who commits it rather than the one who suffers it. Stranded on a planet that legalizes unrestricted violence on a single annual night, Morty ingests a candy laced with a compound that removes inhibitions and participates in the purge with enthusiasm that goes well beyond self-defense. He shoots people who are hiding. He shoots people who are trying to escape. The episode eventually reveals that the candy he consumed had been reformulated to remove the compound, which means the violence was Morty's own rather than chemically induced. The show makes this point clearly, gives it a beat, and moves on. Morty is capable of mass violence when the social contract that usually prevents it is removed. This is presented as a dark joke. It is also presented as true. The pattern running through all of these episodes is not nihilism in the sense that the show does not care about the content it is packaging. The show clearly cares, because the care is what makes the technique function. You cannot feel the discomfort underneath a joke if the joke has not been precisely built to contain the discomfort. What the technique reflects is something closer to a philosophy about how human beings actually process terrible things, which is that laughter is one of the primary mechanisms people use to metabolize horror, and that a show willing to present horror in that register is doing something that a serious drama cannot do, reaching the audience in a place the serious drama cannot access. Rick and Morty constructs its comedy from genuinely disturbing premises because the comedy is the delivery system, not the destination. The destination, as the show keeps demonstrating episode after episode, is the moment when the laughter stops being available and what is underneath it becomes visible. Not every viewer reaches that moment, and the show does not require them to. The jokes work on their own terms. But for the audience that does sit with the math of the microverse, the full implications of the Meeseeks design, the question of who Ruben actually was before his body became a theme park, the technique reveals something about how much darkness a properly constructed joke can carry without the weight becoming visible. The answer the show keeps providing is more than most people think and more than is entirely comfortable uncomfortable to acknowledge. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The crimes played as comedy showed how the show packages genuine ethical horror inside the rhythm of a punchline, and what becomes visible when the laughter runs out. Next, the focus moves to a single location that concentrates all of these patterns into one image, the Citadel of Ricks, a civilization built on the systematic abuse of children and what it reveals when examined as a functioning society rather than a plot device. Section 5. The Citadel's Hidden Horror. There is a shot near the opening of the Rick-Lantis mix-up, the 7th episode of the 3rd season, that the show holds for just long enough to register before moving on. A Morty in business casual clothes steps out of a coffee shop and raises his hand to hail a taxi. The cab drives past him without stopping. It pulls up a few yards further down the street to collect a Rick who has just stepped off the curb. The Morty watches this happen. The episode continues. Nothing more is said about the moment because nothing more needs to be said. The whole society has just been described in 4 seconds of animation. The Citadel of Ricks is introduced earlier in the series as a piece of world building that the show treats primarily as an opportunity for Rick to demonstrate his contempt for institutional authority. A city populated entirely by variants of the same man, governed by a council of Ricks, serviced by the Mortys assigned to them, existing in a pocket dimension that allows every version of this one man to gather and organize across the infinite multiverse. The premise is presented with the show's characteristic mixture of absurdist comedy and genuine conceptual ambition, and for the first 2 seasons it functions mainly as a backdrop for plots about Rick's complicated relationship with his own duplicates. It is not until the Rick-Lantis mix-up that the show turns its full attention to what the Citadel actually is when examined as a functioning society rather than a setting, and what it finds there is considerably darker than the earlier episodes had bothered to articulate. The episode follows several separate storylines running through the Citadel simultaneously, rather than tracking the main Rick and Morty on a conventional adventure. And each storyline is a different angle on the same portrait. A pair of police officers, one Rick and one Morty, navigate a night shift that reveals the depth of the prejudice structuring their partnership. A group of young Mortys on their last day at a school designed not to educate them, but to calibrate them toward obedience, make a final visit to a wishing portal. A factory worker, Rick, confronts the executive profiting from the exploitation of a colleague trapped in a machine that harvests his brain chemicals. A Morty, running for the Citadel's presidency on a message of dignity and fairness, turns out to be something the episode's final minutes reveal with the clarity of a trap closing. Each storyline is doing individual work, but the cumulative picture they assemble is consistent. The Citadel is a society organized around a single principle that its residents never name directly because it is so thoroughly built into the structure of every institution that naming it would feel like naming gravity. Ricks are in charge. Mortys serve. The hierarchy is not a matter of demonstrated individual ability or earned status. It is a categorical assignment. A Morty is a Morty before he has done anything, and what he is categorically determines where he can live, what work he can do, whether a taxi will stop for him, whether a teacher will take him seriously, whether the police officer beside him trusts him or watches him for betrayal. The Citadel is a caste system, and the caste is determined at birth by which version of the family's DNA you happened to inherit. The school that appears in the Morty storyline is the episode's most direct statement of what the Citadel does with its Mortys when they have lost or outlived their assigned Ricks. The building's stated purpose is education, but the curriculum is calibration. The classroom posters visible in the background of the sequence include an image of a Morty face framed inside a recycling symbol with the word recycle printed beneath it. The teacher is a Rick who makes no particular effort to conceal his contempt for his students or his certainty about the ceiling above which no Morty will ever rise, regardless of what happens in this classroom. The education on offer is instruction in how to be useful to a Rick, how to suppress the instincts and impulses that might lead a Morty to resist or question or want something outside the role assigned to him. The school is a factory, and the product is compliance. Slick, the Morty who leads the group of students at the center of this storyline, has served 5 different Ricks. The show delivers this detail in passing, treating it as a piece of background information rather than a focal point, which is exactly the right instinct, because the detail is most disturbing when it is not commented upon. A Morty who has belonged to 5 different Ricks is a Morty who has been reassigned 5 times, which in the world of the Citadel means he has outlived or been separated from his previous owners and cycled into the system to be paired with another. The academic essay that analyzed the episode's racial and social politics drew the parallel explicitly, noting that a Morty who has served served multiple Ricks carries the same structural echoes as the sale and resale of enslaved people in pre-abolitionist America, a parallel the show does not belabor but clearly built into the premise. Mortys are assigned. They are reassigned when the assignment ends. The system that does this treating is identical to the system that handled other categories of beings as property to be allocated, rather than people to be considered. The Mortytown sequence, which follows the police officer storyline through the Citadel's most economically depressed neighborhood, is where the social portrait becomes most viscerally uncomfortable. Mortytown is the area of the Citadel where Mortys who have no assigned Rick and cannot be paired with a new one are warehoused. The area has all the features of a ghetto generated by deliberate policy rather than natural circumstance. The resource deprivation, the concentrated crime, the police presence that operates through violence rather than protection, the atmosphere of managed containment rather than genuine community. The episode does not editorialize about this. It simply shows what Mortytown looks like from the street level, as experienced by beings who live in it, and trusts the audience to recognize the structure they are seeing. The police officer, Rick, who patrols Mortytown with his Morty partner, does not see the neighborhood the way its residents do, because he has the perspective of someone who passes through rather than someone who belongs. His discomfort with his Morty partner is consistent and casual, the kind of discomfort that comes from a bias so thoroughly absorbed that its holder genuinely does not experience it as bias, only as an accurate read of the situation. When the Morty partner eventually betrays the Rick partner in a moment of chaos, the episode does not present this as a vindication of the Rick's distrust. It presents it as what the environment produces in a being who has been categorically excluded from the possibility of advancement and watched his community policed through brutality rather than served through protection. The betrayal is the rational response of a person who has no reason to extend loyalty to a system that does not extend it to him. The factory storyline delivers the episode's most explicit indictment of what the Citadel's economic structure does to the Ricks at the bottom of its hierarchy. A worker Rick discovers that a colleague, a gentle and simple version of their shared identity, referred to as Simple Rick, has been captured and installed in a machine that harvests the chemical output of his brain during moments of happiness, which is then used to flavor a brand of cookies called Simple Rick's Wafers. The marketing presents Simple Rick's contentment as a product, his private experience of peace distilled into a commodity for sale to the very population he has been extracted from. The executive who profits from the arrangement has built a business model on the sustained exploitation of a conscious being's inner life, selling the experience of happiness produced by a man imprisoned in a machine to people looking for a taste of something they cannot access through the conditions of their own lives. The episode's final twist, in which the presidential candidate whose campaign has centered on dignity and fairness for the downtrodden is revealed to be Evil Morty, functions as the sharpest possible illustration of what the Citadel actually produces. The system the Ricks built to ensure their supremacy has, through the logic of its own design, created the single most dangerous being it will ever face. Evil Morty is not an anomaly in the Citadel's history. He is its most efficient graduate, the Morty who understood the system completely enough to weaponize it, who studied the Rick's arrogance until it became a predictable weakness, and who built a decade-spanning plan on the certainty that no Rick would ever take a Morty seriously enough to see him coming. The villain of the Citadel storyline is the villain the Citadel manufactured, and the show is absolutely clear about the causal relationship between the environment and the response it generates. Later seasons deepen the portrait of what the Citadel actually did to produce and maintain its population of Mortys. The 5th season finale's revelations about how the Citadel sourced its Mortys are particularly disturbing when examined without the pace of the plot carrying the audience past them. The demand for Mortys, as the Citadel expanded and the population of Ricks grew, eventually outstripped the natural supply available through the multiverse's existing Rick-Morty family structures. The Citadel's response was to engineer the production of more Mortys, arranging for Beth and Jerry variants to meet and reproduce across dimensions specifically to generate the children the institution required. And when even that supply proved insufficient, to begin cloning. The Citadel cloned children. It mass-produced them, shipped them to Ricks across the multiverse as assigned companions, erased their memories when they died or were discarded, and replaced them with new clones carrying the old memories implanted fresh. The Season 8 episode that revisited the Citadel's remnants in a Western format storyline, named Homesteader Rick, as having been the Citadel's lead scientist in Morty cloning, a character who, by the present day, carries genuine shame about his role in the institution's most systematic abuse of its Morty population, and who has spent the intervening intervening years working against the kind of structure he helped build. The detail is introduced and then moved past quickly, which is the show doing its characteristic technique with unusually heavy material. A man overseeing the mass production of children for institutional assignment is a man engaged in something that has a name in the real world, and the show gives the character self-awareness about this without dwelling on what it means at the level that awareness demands. Evil Morty's final speech in the Season 5 finale lands differently once the full picture of the Citadel's operations has been assembled. He is not simply a villain with ambitions that exceed his station. He is a being who has witnessed and survived the full machinery of a system designed to use him, who understands it from the inside, and whose response is not to seek reform or representation within it, but to destroy it entirely and walk out into the open multiverse beyond, where no version of his species' tormentor rules by design. The show frames his departure not as a triumph of evil, but as the exit of someone whose grievance the narrative has established as entirely legitimate. He wanted out. The institution he escaped was doing to him, and every being like him, exactly what the audience has spent 3 seasons watching it do. The escape is presented as something the show cannot quite bring itself to call wrong, because the audience has seen what he was escaping from. What the Citadel storyline reveals about the show's ambitions is that it was willing to embed a sustained critique of systematic abuse, exploitation, and the mechanics of institutionalized oppression inside a science fiction comedy about infinite variations of the same man, and to do it with enough specificity and care that the critique was identifiable as such, rather than disappearing into the absurdist noise. The taxi scene at the opening, the recycling poster in the classroom, the simple Rick machine, the cloning program, the police brutality in Mortytown, these are not random dark details scattered through a plot for atmosphere. They are the components of a coherent portrait of how a society organizes itself to exploit a population it has decided does not count. And the show builds that portrait through the episode's visual choices and structural decisions, rather than through dialogue that explains what the audience is looking at. The Citadel is the show's most fully realized world, apart from the Smith family's home dimension. And what it fully realizes is a civilization built on the systematic abuse of beings who are, within the logic of the show's universe, children. Every Morty in the Citadel is a version of a 14-year-old boy. The entire population of Mortytown is 14-year-old boys warehoused in urban decay without resources or protection. The school calibrating the next generation toward compliance is a school for children. The cloning program producing Mortys on demand is producing children on demand, shipping them across the multiverse as assigned companions and erasing and replacing them when they expire. The institution that the smartest man in the universe built to protect himself is, when the camera holds on it long enough, a machine for the organized exploitation of children at industrial scale. The show put all of this on screen and packaged it inside comedy and never once made a speech about it, because the show trusted the audience to see what was in the frame. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Citadel's hidden horror showed what the show built at civilizational scale when it examined what the Rick-Morty dynamic looked like multiplied across infinity. Next, the focus moves outside the show entirely, to the man whose voice created all of it, and the full documented record of what emerged about Justin Roiland in the years after the show became a cultural phenomenon. Section 6. The voice that created it. For most of the show's early run, Justin Roiland was the version of the origin story that journalists most wanted to tell. He was a former reality television producer from the Central Valley of California who had bounced around the edges of the animation industry for years, failing to launch 3 separate pilots at Fox before Rick and Morty, receiving cease and desist letters from Bill Cosby's lawyers over a different project, and nearly losing the voice role on his own show when a network executive suggested recasting. The story of how he got there had all the components of a comeback narrative: the years of rejection, the accidental meeting with a collaborator, the pitch delivered at exactly the right moment, and the show that emerged from all of it was genuinely unlike anything else on television. The narrative wrote itself, and Roiland told it well in interviews, with the self-deprecating ease of someone who had processed a decade of failure into material and arrived on the other side with something worth the wait. He was also, more than almost any other figure in contemporary animation, the voice. Both voices, Rick Sanchez and Morty Smith, were performed by the same person, which meant that every exchange between them, every moment of tension and manipulation and genuine care, was Roiland in conversation with himself across 2 registers, one older and weathered and slurring with drink and contempt, one younger and frightened and desperate to be valued. The technique was rooted in improvisation. He would record through Rick's lines and then return and record Morty's responses, holding both characters in his his head simultaneously and letting them genuinely react to each other rather than delivering pre-written exchanges against the memory of a read-through. The result was the show's most distinctive quality, a rhythm between its two central characters that felt organic rather than scripted, the kind of conversational texture that usually required two separate performers finding each other across takes. What The Hollywood Reporter established in a 2023 investigation was that the voice was, by multiple accounts from people who worked on the shows he co-created, essentially the full extent of his contribution to the productions carrying his name. The investigation gathered testimony from numerous individuals employed on Rick and Morty and Solar Opposites, and the picture that emerged was consistent across sources. Several people said they had not heard from Roiland in years, despite being employed on his shows. Others said that despite working on productions he had co-created and continued to receive credit for, they had never actually met him. The voice work arrived remotely. The creator himself was frequently absent from everything else. The show was being made by the people around him, and the people around him were making it without him in any meaningful daily sense. This structural detail matters less as a criticism of his creative contribution than as context for understanding how the rest of the story unfolded without triggering any meaningful intervention from within the professional community nominally surrounding him. A creator who is present in the room, who attends the writer's room and sits in production meetings and argues about scripts, and whose behavior is therefore visible daily to colleagues and subject to the ordinary social regulation of a shared workplace, is a different kind of person from a creator who delivers his performances remotely and operates at arm's length from everyone actually making his show. The distance Roiland maintained from the day-to-day production of Rick and Morty was the same distance that insulated his off-hours conduct from any accountability mechanism within the production itself. Nobody in the room could see what was happening, because Roiland was rarely in the room. The incident that would eventually end his career at Adult Swim began in January 2020. Roiland was charged in Orange County, California, with 2 felony counts arising from an alleged incident with an unnamed woman he had been dating. The first charge was domestic battery with corporal injury. The second was false imprisonment by menace, violence, fraud, and deceit. He was arrested in August 2020, released on a bond of $50,000, and arraigned in October of that year. He pleaded not guilty. The case moved through the California court system across the following 2.5 years, with periodic pretrial hearings and a protective order preventing him from approaching the alleged victim. Throughout this entire period, Roiland continued working. He continued voicing Rick and Morty through the 6th season, continued his involvement with Solar Opposites and Koala Man, and the charges, which were a matter of public court record, remained essentially unknown to the wider entertainment press and to the audience watching his shows. That ended in January 2023. NBC News published the first mainstream report on the charges, timed to coincide with a scheduled pre-trial hearing that made the case's existence easier to establish from public records. The report broke through to broad public attention within hours. The response from the networks employing him was immediate in a way that suggested the charges were not news to everyone in a position to act on them. Adult Swim released a statement the same week, confirming it had ended its association with Justin Roiland. Hulu followed within days, cutting ties with him on both Solar Opposites and Koala Man. Roiland resigned from Squanch Games, the video game development company he had co-founded in 2016. His attorney issued a statement describing the media coverage as inaccurate and expressing confidence the case would be dismissed on review of the evidence. The statement maintained his complete innocence. In March 2023, the Orange County District Attorney's Office announced that all charges had been dropped. The office's spokesperson stated the decision had been made as a result of having insufficient evidence to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. Roiland posted a response on social media saying he had always known the claims were false and that he was looking forward to focusing on his creative projects and restoring what he called his good name. He described himself as still deeply shaken by what he characterized as horrible lies. Adult Swim and Hulu declined to comment on the development. The separations remained in place at both networks regardless. The reason those separations held through the drop charges became significantly clearer in September 2023, when NBC News published a second investigation. This one was built from interviews with 11 women and non-binary people who shared thousands of messages they had exchanged with Roiland between 2013 and 2022. The investigation was separate from the domestic violence case that had been dismissed, arising instead from a pattern of behavior the sources described across a decade of contact, initiated through social media media, and dating applications. 9 of the 11 people interviewed told the outlet that Roiland had initiated or escalated their conversations toward sexual content. 3 of those 9 said they were 16 years old when Roiland began communicating with them. In those 3 cases, the reporting noted, Roiland had paused the communication while the person was a minor and resumed it once they had reached adulthood, which indicated an awareness of their age rather than ignorance of it. The pattern the investigation documented had recognizable recurring features across accounts spanning nearly a decade. Roiland would follow or contact fans on social media platforms or dating applications. He would open conversations by noting their connection to Rick and Morty, complimenting their appearance or their creative work, and establishing that he was the person who had made the show they loved. He would ask about their location and their age. He would inquire about their sexual orientation with a consistency across different accounts that suggested the question was a standard element of how he opened these contacts, rather than an occasional personal curiosity. In a number of cases, he offered to cover the costs of in-person meetings, including transportation and accommodation. The sourcing NBC News brought to bear on these accounts included photographs, videos, emails, social media posts, and receipts provided by the interviewees, material the outlet used to corroborate the accounts rather than relying on testimony alone. The most serious allegation in the investigation was made by a woman who described meeting Roiland through a dating application in March 2019 when she was 20 years old and he was in Boston for a gaming convention. She told the outlet she had informed him she was underage at the time, which he responded to by buying her 2 alcoholic drinks. She alleged that when she declined his request for a sexual act, he physically pushed her head toward him and she stopped resisting. She said she called a friend immediately afterward and described what had happened, and NBC News reported verifying this account directly with that friend. Text messages from approximately 4 months after the incident showed the woman confronting Roiland in writing about the encounter, describing it as not handled in the best way, and his reply acknowledged the concern in terms that the outlet described as an apology. Additional accounts described a range of conduct. Multiple women described conversations that shifted towards sexual content shortly after initial contact. One source described attending a gathering where Roiland offered her alcohol despite knowing she was underage. Another described being flown to Los Angeles at Roiland's expense and experiencing an encounter she described as traumatic. In multiple accounts, sources described the initial contact as making them feel special and chosen, specifically because of who Roiland was and what he had made, and the investigation was clear-eyed about the mechanism the reporting suggested he was using: the cultural capital accumulated by co-creating a globally beloved show being applied as a tool for access rather than simply a fact about who he was. Resurfaced public material from earlier in Roiland's career added context to the investigation's findings without constituting new allegations. Podcast appearances from 2011 included statements, delivered as jokes in that context, about the appeal of inhabiting a younger body with adult knowledge, framed as humor about nostalgia, but containing implications that read differently given everything that subsequently emerged. A separate interview contained comments about historical norms around the age at which girls were considered women, presented as social commentary about what Roiland described as an overly precious contemporary attitude toward age-related restrictions. These were public statements made in professional contexts to audiences that received them as the eccentricities of a creative personality, rather than signals of anything requiring attention. Roiland's representatives denied the most serious allegations in the NBC investigation. No criminal charges arose from the September 2023 reporting. Roiland himself made no public statements addressing the specific claims after the investigation was published, and has remained largely absent from public life since. The legal record, as it currently stands, reflects a man who was charged with 2 felonies, pleaded not guilty, and had those charges dropped for insufficient evidence. No subsequent criminal proceedings have followed. The recasting of Rick and Morty had been organized in the months following the January 2023 separation, and was announced before the September investigation. The 7th season premiered on October 15, 2023, with Ian Cardoni voicing Rick and Harry Belden voicing Morty. Adult Swim described both actors as sound-alikes, acknowledging the practical difficulty of replacing voices that had been the show's most recognizable audio element for 6 seasons. Critical responses to the new performances were largely positive. The 7th season earned reviews that placed it among the stronger runs in the show's history, with several critics noting that the production appeared to have benefited from the absence of the complications that had surrounded Roiland's involvement. The show that had been built around one person's voice turned out to be substantially essentially a product of the people who had been making it daily all along, and those people made it well without him. His name remained on screen. Roiland is a co-creator of Rick and Morty, and the intellectual property and credit conventions that govern television production protect creator credits as a matter of contractual right, rather than ongoing approval. His executive producer credit appears on every episode the show airs, and will continue to appear for however many seasons remain in its run. The network that issued a one-line statement ending its association with him in January 2023 continues to broadcast his name on every episode of the show that association produced. This is not a commentary on the network's choices, which are constrained by legal realities, but a factual description of the outcome. The man whose name was removed from every active professional relationship at two major networks in January 2023 is credited on screen every time the show he co-created airs. The show itself continued making the same kinds of episodes it had always made. The 7th season contained material examining toxic relationships, the abuse of power between people in unequal positions, and the price paid by the less powerful party in a dynamic built around the needs of the more powerful one. The 8th season continued in the same direction. The creative team that had been doing most of the work all along kept doing it, and the show they made without Roiland's daily presence was, by most measures, not visibly diminished by his absence. The voice was replaced with reasonable approximations. The creative engine had been running on other fuel for years. What the Roiland story leaves behind is a question that each person watching the show resolves individually, and that the available evidence does not fully answer. The show's central relationship between an older man of enormous capability and a teenage boy he manipulates and endangers in service of his own needs while maintaining genuine affection for the boy was drawn from a short film in which a young character was pressured into a deeply inappropriate situation. The same creator who built that dynamic into the show's DNA staged the King Jellybean incident with deliberate horror and publicly confirmed it was meant to be realistic and disturbing. The post-credit scene he helped create depicted the institutional burial of a troubling history. The show is not naive about inappropriate behavior or how it operates. The relationship between that awareness in the creative work and the conduct alleged in the NBC investigation is not resolvable from the outside, and the legal record does not provide a verdict. What the record does provide is a timeline, and the timeline is specific. Between 2013 and 2022, according to the sources in the NBC investigation, the co-creator of a show watched by tens of millions of people was using the celebrity that show generated to contact fans, some of whom were minors when the contact began. During that same period, the show he co-created was airing episodes containing some of the most carefully constructed depictions of predatory behavior in adult animation, staged with an understanding of how such behavior actually works that went beyond what the genre typically supplied. Those two facts sit in the record together. What they mean together is a question that belongs to each viewer, weighted against the evidence available and the evidence that is not, and against whatever they decide about the relationship between what a person makes and what a person does. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The full picture of the show's co-creator is now on the table. The charges, the investigation, the recasting, and the credit that still appears on screen. Next, the focus moves to the other man who built Rick and Morty, and the documented case of misconduct that Dan Harmon publicly confessed to in 7 minutes of audio that became, in its own strange way, a model for how these moments should be handled. Section 7. The other man in the room. Dan Harmon built his public reputation on a specific kind of honesty. He was the creator of Community, the critically beloved NBC sitcom that ran for 6 seasons and generated the kind of devoted fan following that kept it alive past several near cancellations. He was the host of Harmontown, a podcast that he ran for years as a semi-public confessional, a space where he discussed his failures and neuroses and professional humiliations with a kind of transparency that most people in his position would have hired a publicist to prevent. He had a documented history of saying things out loud that other people in the entertainment industry kept carefully private, and his audience rewarded him for this with a loyalty that read less like fandom and more like the response people have to someone who tells them the truth when everyone else in the room is performing. So when Megan Gans, a former writer on Community, sent a message on Twitter in January 2018 that suggested Harmon had done something to her that she had never been able to fully articulate publicly, the observation that followed from people who knew Harmon's work was not that the accusation seemed out of character. It was that whatever had happened, Harmon would eventually talk about it publicly, because talking about difficult things publicly was the mode he had built his entire secondary career around. The question was whether that capacity for transparency would hold when the difficult thing was something he had done rather than something that had been been done to him? The answer came within days. Gans posted a tweet recommending that people listen to the latest episode of Harmontown, the podcast she had followed since her time working with Harmon. What Harmon delivered in that episode was a 7-minute monologue that the entertainment press and Gans herself would describe as remarkable, not for excusing anything, but for refusing to excuse anything. He spoke about what he had done with a clarity that was not constructed for sympathy, and a specificity that went further than most public apologies from people in positions of power tended to go. The situation Harmon described had begun during his tenure as showrunner on Community. He was the person who decided whether Gans kept her job. He was the person who determined whether she felt good about herself or not in the room, in his words, and whether she stayed or went. He described being attracted to her and knowing immediately that this was a problem he should have managed by simply not acting on it. Instead, he behaved in what he called a flirty, creepy manner. When she did not reciprocate, he retaliated. He drank. He took pills. He described resenting her for not returning feelings she had never invited and had no obligation to have. He said horrible things, his words, to and about her. He was the one writing her paychecks throughout all of this, holding all the structural power in the relationship, and he used that structural advantage in the service of his own emotional dysfunction rather than any professional purpose. He told his podcast audience that he had lied to himself throughout the entire period, constructing a version of the situation that kept him from having to look directly at what he was doing. He said he had lost his job, ruined his show, betrayed his audience, and destroyed everything, and that he had damaged what he called her internal compass. The phrase was precise in a way that most public apologies from people in his position were not, because it named the specific harm rather than generalizing the wrongdoing into a category. He did not say he had made her uncomfortable, which would have been accurate but incomplete. He said he had damaged something in her ability to read and trust her own responses, which is what sustained harassment from a person in authority does when it is sustained long enough and denied consistently enough that the target begins to doubt their own perception of events. Gans responded publicly and posted her own statement recommending the episode, which she called a masterclass in how to apologize. She said the goal for her had never been vengeance, but vindication, and that if any part of the process should be done in public, the forgiveness was the part. She forgave him. The statement was generous and, given what she had described experiencing, more than Harmon had any basis to expect. She had been living with the experience for years, and whatever the 7-minute monologue provided to her in terms of acknowledgement, the acknowledgement came years after the conduct, and only because she had first said something publicly that made it impossible to continue the silence. The reason this matters specifically to a discussion of Rick and Morty, rather than simply as a matter of record about one of the show's two creators, is the relationship between the conduct and the creative work. Dan Harmon built Rick and Morty alongside Justin Roiland. The show's central dynamic, the relationship between a powerful older figure and a younger, less powerful person whose well-being he is supposed to be responsible for, and the ways that relationship involves manipulation, control, retaliation, and the abuse of a structural advantage, is not incidental to the show's concerns. The show examines that dynamic with genuine sophistication and unusual honesty. The therapist scene in Pickle Rick is the most concentrated single moment of that examination, but the pattern runs through every season. Dan Harmon is the person who built the writing infrastructure around which that examination was structured. He is the showrunner who shaped how the writer's room developed the Rick-Morty dynamic over multiple seasons, who guided the show toward its most pointed analyses of how Rick uses his power over Morty and what that use costs both of them. He is also, by his own public account, a person who during the years immediately before Rick and Morty's development used his position of professional authority over a writer who worked for him to harass her, retaliated when she did not respond the way he wanted, and spent years managing his own self-deception well enough that he did not fully confront what he had done until she forced the confrontation publicly. The Gans harassment took place during Community and was therefore a matter Harmon had resolved, or at least addressed, before Rick and Morty's most substantial seasons were produced. The apology and the public accounting came in 2018, which placed it during the show's third season, before the majority of the run had been written. Gans accepted the apology and has not indicated any ongoing professional harm. The situation, in the terms the two people at its center have described it, was addressed rather than buried. This is a meaningfully different situation from cases in which conduct was ongoing, concealed, or met with institutional protection rather than eventual public acknowledgement. What it is not, however, is irrelevant to the reading of the show. Harmon's own diagnosis of his behavior during the Community period, the description he gave of using his structural power to manage someone's professional experience in service of his own emotional needs, is a description that maps with uncomfortable precision onto the dynamic that Rick and Morty is built around. The show's most sustained critical engagement is with what it means for an enormously capable person to use that capability in the service of his own psychological avoidance, and what it costs the less powerful people in his orbit when he does. Harmon described doing exactly that to Megan Gans. He then spent the following years helping to develop a show whose central moral concern is precisely the harm produced when a brilliant person uses their advantages to manage and control rather than genuinely support the people around them. The show's therapist, Dr. Wong, says in Pickle Rick that the family uses intelligence to justify its sickness. The writers put that line in the script. Harmon was in the room when it was developed. The line is an accurate description of what Harmon himself had done in the community writers' room, by his own account, using the intelligence and capability that made him valuable as a showrunner to construct a sophisticated self-deception that allowed him to harass a colleague for years without confronting what he was doing. The line is also one of the most precise pieces of writing in the show's run, arriving at an understanding of the central family's dysfunction that the series had been building toward for 2.5 seasons. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the relationship between them is something each viewer can weight as they choose. The community writers' room, during the period Harmon described, was not a safe environment for Gans. The power structure of a television writers' room places the showrunner at the center of everything, controlling who gets to speak, whose jokes make it into the script, whose contributions are valued, and who stays employed. A showrunner who is using that centrality to pursue and then punish a writer who works for him is a showrunner who has converted the creative space of the room into something that serves his personal agenda. Gans described the impact on her internal compass, the damage to her capacity to trust her own perceptions and responses, which is the specific kind of harm that sustained harassment from a person in authority produces when it occurs in a space where the target cannot simply leave without professional consequence. The response to the Harmontown episode was notably different from the response that most public figures received when their misconduct became public during the period immediately surrounding the wider cultural conversation about workplace harassment that was happening in 2017 and 2018. Harmon was not fired. He was not dropped by networks or stripped of his projects. He was criticized, and the criticism was real and substantive, but the response from the industry was closer to acknowledgement than consequence. The show continued. His position as showrunner continued. The consensus that emerged, shaped in part by Gans's own public decision to forgive and move forward, was that the public accounting had been sufficient, that a person who confessed that completely and specifically had done more than most and was entitled to continue working. Whether that consensus was correct is not a question this video can answer. What it can note is that the man who helped create the show's most sustained engagement with the harm a powerful person does when they manage rather than genuinely connect with the people around them had, by his own admission, spent years doing precisely that. The show's understanding of how this kind of harm works is not purely theoretical. It was developed by people who knew what it looked like from the inside, from both sides of the dynamic, and the quality of the show's analysis of the Rick-Morty relationship carries some trace of that knowledge, though tracing exactly how any specific life experience makes its way into any specific piece of creative work is more art than science. What can be traced is the pattern. Harmon described managing his own emotional needs at the expense of someone who worked for him, using structural power to control the conditions of her professional life, and constructing a self-sustaining self-deception that prevented him from seeing what he was doing until someone outside the deception forced the confrontation. The show he co-created depicts a character who manages his own emotional needs at the expense of someone who travels with him, uses structural power to control the conditions of that person's existence, and constructs a self-sustaining self-deception that prevents him from seeing what he is doing until the series itself forces the confrontation. The parallel is not a coincidence, though it is also not a simple equation. Artists make work from what they know. Harmon knew this particular territory from a direction that is uncomfortable to sit with, given which direction he knew it from. The show's eventual willingness to name what Rick does to Morty as something that costs Morty, rather than merely inconveniences him. To let the therapist say plainly that the family uses intelligence to justify sickness, rather than simply implying it through narrative consequence, came from writers who could write that observation with the specificity it has because they understood the mechanism behind it. Whether that understanding came at a price worth paying, paid by someone who did not have the option of declining to pay it, is the question that Harmon's 7 minutes of audio raised, and that his broader career since has not fully answered. Before we move move on. If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 7 examined the documented conduct of the show's other creator, and the uncomfortable relationship between what he confessed to doing and the dynamic the show he built examines most carefully. Next, the focus moves outside the production entirely and into the world the show generated around itself, where 3 separate incidents involving its fan base became news stories in their own right. Section 8. The fandom that became the story. October 7th, 2017 was supposed to be a good day for Rick and Morty fans. McDonald's had announced it would bring back its Szechuan dipping sauce, a limited promotional condiment from 1998 that had been created to accompany the release of the animated film Mulan, and that had essentially disappeared from public memory for nearly 2 decades afterward. Its resurrection was directly linked to the show. The 3rd season premiere had aired as a surprise on April Fool's Day. A single episode dropped without warning in a rare programming move, and its final minutes had featured Rick delivering an extended monologue about his desperate need to taste the Szechuan sauce again, framing the discontinued condiment as his entire motivation for existence and declaring it his series arc. A bit of deliberately absurdist comedy from a show that specialized in exactly that register. The bit landed, the audience laughed, and then a significant portion of that audience decided the bit was not a bit. The campaign to bring the sauce back began almost immediately after the episode aired. Fans petitioned McDonald's. The show's creators received a large novelty jug of recreated sauce from the chain as a publicity gesture. And Justin Roiland confirmed publicly that the sauce had no narrative significance whatsoever and was simply a joke. This confirmation had essentially no effect on the campaign. McDonald's, recognizing an opportunity in the enthusiasm, announced that it would stage a one-day event on October 7th, reintroducing the sauce at select locations across the United States. The announcement generated enormous anticipation in the fandom. People planned travel. Some drove significant distances to reach a participating location. Lines began forming before the event officially opened. McDonald's had not prepared adequately for what was about to happen. Sources differ on exactly how many packets were allocated to each participating restaurant, but reports from multiple locations suggested some stores received as few as 20 packets for an event that drew hundreds of people. The lines were out the door before opening. Locations began running out within minutes of service starting. When employees informed the people still waiting that the sauce was gone, the response from a portion of the crowd was not frustration absorbed quietly. The response was a demonstration. At various locations around the country, the scenes that followed were documented on video and uploaded immediately. Fans chanted. A man climbed onto a McDonald's counter, screamed the catchphrase "Pickle Rick" and the show's signature phrase "Wubba Lubba Dub Dub," and rolled around on the floor before running out of the store. Police were called to manage crowds at several locations. Reports circulated about physical altercations, though accounts of the worst alleged incidents were difficult to verify. What was documented and verified by multiple news outlets was that minimum wage McDonald's employees, who had no involvement in the decision to stage the event or the decision to undersupply it, spent hours facing abuse from adults who were angry about the unavailability of a dipping sauce. One woman in Michigan reportedly traded her car to another fan in exchange for a single packet of the sauce. Individual packets appeared on eBay within hours at prices that reached $250. McDonald's, which had not coordinated the event with anyone connected to the show, despite producing marketing materials that leaned heavily on the show's visual language and terminology, issued an apology on social media the same day, promising to bring the sauce back in larger quantities that winter. Dan Harmon described the company as having robbed the creators by staging a branded event without their involvement or authorization. Roiland posted a message urging fans to be cool toward McDonald's workers, making explicit that the employees were not responsible for any of it. The sauce returned in February 2018 with significantly larger supply. By then, the cultural moment had passed, and the sauce's second return in 2022, available only through the McDonald's app, attracted minimal attention. The Szechuan sauce incident is the one that made international news and became the image most commonly associated with the Rick and Morty fandom's worst tendencies. But it was not the first time the fandom had generated a story that reflected badly on the show it claimed to love. That distinction belongs to what happened to Jane Becker and Jessica Gao approximately 2 weeks before the sauce riots, in September 2017, during the middle of the show's 3rd season. Becker and Gao were 2 of the female writers hired for the 3rd season, part of an effort by the show's production to achieve gender balance in its writing room. Rick and Morty had been criticized in its earlier seasons for having an almost entirely male writing staff, and the move to hire women was both a response to that criticism and a straightforward professional decision about expanding the range of perspectives contributing to the scripts. Neither Becker nor Gao had done anything to make themselves visible to the audience beyond having their names appear in the writing credits of the episodes they worked on. Rickmancing the Stone and Pickle Rick were the episodes that credited them, two of the strongest and most discussed episodes of the third season. Someone, later attributed to users on 4chan, published the personal information of both writers online. The information included details that enabled direct contact. What followed was a coordinated campaign of harassment directed at Becker and Gao through social media and email, built around the claim that their presence on the writing staff represented some form of political correctness corrupting the show's creative output. The harassment included threats. The implicit and occasionally explicit message of the campaign was that women should not be writing this show, and that the episodes they had worked on were evidence of a decline caused by their involvement. Dan Harmon's public response was unambiguous. In an interview with Entertainment Weekly, he described the behavior as disgusting and offensive, and his characterization of the people doing it was pointed rather than diplomatic. He identified the conduct as coming from a section of the fan base that he said was using the show as a vehicle for a creepy agenda, attempting to protect what they imagined was their property against the presence of women. He noted that the framing of individual writers as responsible for the perceived failings of specific episodes fundamentally misunderstood how television writing works, where scripts are collaborative products shaped by a room rather than the individual credited writer. He also said something that cut more sharply than a defense of his colleagues, which was that he found this behavior offensive as someone born male and white, framing the harassment not only as wrong, but as an embarrassment to the demographic the harassers apparently imagined they were defending. The irony that the episode most associated with the harassment campaign was Pickle Rick, widely considered one of the finest episodes in the show's entire run, was not lost on observers at the time. The episode that a portion of the fandom decided was evidence that women were damaging their show was the episode that received the most critical praise of the season, and that generated the most substantial cultural discussion about the show's themes. Jessica Gao, who wrote it, went on to win an Emmy Award for the episode. The harassment campaign aimed at her produced no measurable effect on the show's quality, and documented precisely what Harmon said it documented: a section of the fandom more interested in the demographic identity of the people writing their show than in whether the show was good. The third incident that made the Rick and Morty fandom a news story in its own right was different in character from both the sauce riots and the harassment campaign, because it originated not from malice, but from a combination of sincere belief and internet amplification, and because what it revealed was not anger, but a particular kind of pride that was arguably more unsettling than the anger. In July 2017, a post appeared on Reddit that quickly spread across multiple platforms and became one of the most widely circulated pieces of fan commentary in the show's history. The post was a defense of the show's complexity against unnamed critics, and its central argument was that Rick and Morty required a high IQ to understand, that the show's intelligence was not accessible to ordinary minds, and that people who disliked the show were therefore simply not intelligent enough to appreciate what it was doing. The post was sincere. Its author appeared to genuinely believe what they were writing, and the way it spread, through mockery rather than agreement, transformed it into something it had not been designed to be: a cultural artifact that said something true about a recognizable strain in the fandom, even as it said it in a way that made the strain difficult to take seriously. The mockery was immediate and extensive, and came from inside as well as outside the fan community, with Harmon and others connected to the show making clear they found the attitude that produced the post both embarrassing and inaccurate. The show's writers had consistently maintained that Rick and Morty was meant to be accessible rather than exclusionary, that the comedy operated on multiple levels precisely so that different audiences could find their way into it, and that treating the show as an intelligence test was a fundamental misreading of what they were trying to do. What the IQ copypasta, as it came to be known, documented was a specific defensive crouch that had developed in a portion of the fandom, one that converted investment in the show into a claim about personal identity, and then protected that claim with the vocabulary of intelligence and specialness. The show had always courted this possibility, because its central character is explicitly coded as the smartest being in his universe, and the audience that identified with Rick rather than observing him was an audience primed to absorb some of what that identification implied, including the implication that appreciating genius required possessing it. The post was the most naked expression of that implication, and its virality exposed how widely the underlying attitude had spread. Taken together, the three incidents describe a fandom that, in a concentrated period of approximately 2 months in the late summer and autumn of 2017, demonstrated demonstrated three distinct ways in which a passionate audience could transform the show it loved into something damaging. The harassment of Becker and Gao demonstrated that a portion of the audience treated the show as their property to protect against demographic change rather than a creative work belonging to its makers. The Sauce Riots demonstrated that another portion had fused their identification with the show so completely that a corporate promotion's failure to meet their expectations registered as a genuine grievance worth expressing through physical disruption. The IQ copypasta demonstrated that a third strain was using the show as a mirror for a particular self-image rather than engaging with what the show was actually saying. The show itself had things to say about each of these strains if the people exhibiting them had been reading it carefully. Rick's contempt for the Citadel, his refusal to participate in the institution that had organized itself around reverence for his identity, was the show's most direct address to the kind of fan who used Rick as a flattering self-image rather than a critical portrait. The therapist's observation that the family uses intelligence to justify its sickness was the show's clearest statement about what the IQ copypasta was doing. The Citadel's treatment of Mortys as a permanent underclass assigned to serve was the show's most sustained engagement with the dynamics of power and belonging that the harassment campaign had enacted in miniature. The show had been building these arguments across multiple seasons by the time its own fandom illustrated them in real life, which produced the peculiar situation of an audience demonstrating the failures the show was analyzing while watching the show analyze them. Dan Harmon's willingness to publicly criticize the harassment of his female writers came with a complexity the reporting at the time noted but did not dwell on, which was that Harmon himself had already, by the timeline of events, engaged in the conduct toward Megan Gans that he would publicly confess to in January 2018. He was criticizing his fandom for harassing women in his writer's room in September 2017, while still carrying, without public acknowledgement, his own history of harassing a woman in his writer's room. The criticism was accurate, and the behavior it criticized was genuinely wrong, and Harmon's condemnation of it was the appropriate professional response. It was also issued by someone who had not yet made his own public accounting of his own conduct in the same general category of harm. The two facts coexist in the record. What the three fandom incidents collectively produced was a cultural conversation about what a show's audience reveals about the show itself, a conversation Rick and Morty did not particularly want, and that its creators handled with varying degrees of grace. The show's own themes, examined carefully, suggested that the fandom's worst tendencies were not external contamination of something pure, but a predictable byproduct of what the show was selling and how it was selling it. A show that celebrates a character's intelligence while critiquing what that intelligence costs him will attract audiences who receive the celebration more completely than the critique. A show built around a self-consciously cool outsider will attract audiences who want to be self-consciously cool outsiders. A show that depicts contempt for institutions and convention as a form of superiority will attract audiences who want to feel superior to institutions and convention. The show was sophisticated enough to complicate all of these things in its text. The portion of its audience that acted out in 2017 was not engaging with the complication. The sauce was in the end just sauce. McDonald's brought it back twice more after the October 2017 disaster. First in February 2018, with supply sufficient to meet demand, and then again in March 2022 through the app. Neither return generated any particular excitement. The narrative energy that had briefly made a discontinued dipping sauce from a Mulan promotion into a cultural flashpoint dissipated almost completely once the scarcity was removed. What remained was the documentation of what had happened on October 7th. The videos of the counterclimber, the reports of the police presence, the eBay listings, and the image of a woman in Michigan handing over her car in exchange for a small packet of something that turned out to be, by all accounts, fairly ordinary. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The fandom incidents showed what happens when an audience absorbs a show's surface rather than its substance, and what that absorption looks like when it spills into the real world. Next, the focus moves to the substance itself, the actual science underneath the show's premises, and what happens when physicists and biologists examine what Rick and Morty is describing and find more of it plausible than most people expect. Section 9. The real science behind the horror. There is a moment in the second season episode, The Ricks Must Be Crazy, where Rick stands inside the microverse he created and tells one of its inhabitants that nothing matters, that the creature's existence is a lie. The line is written as a villain speech, delivered by a character the show has already established as morally complicated, rather than straightforwardly evil, and the comedy of the moment comes from from Rick's complete indifference to the devastation the words produce. But the line is also, from a certain scientific angle, the most accurate thing Rick says in the entire episode. Because if the premises the show builds its science on are taken seriously, rather than accepted as decoration, the philosophical implications run considerably further than the gag suggests, and the horror underneath the comedy is grounded in ideas that real scientists argue about. The multiverse is where that examination has to begin, because the multiverse is the structural premise on which everything else in the show rests. Rick's portal gun opens passages between parallel realities. The show depicts an infinite multiverse populated by infinite variations of every person and situation and outcome, which is the condition that produces the central finite curve, the citadel, Evil Morty's escape plan, and the entire emotional framework the later seasons are built around. This is presented as science fiction, which it is, but the distance between the show's multiverse premise and the serious scientific literature on the subject is smaller than most audiences assume. Brian Greene, a theoretical physicist at Columbia University, has developed models describing multiple distinct types of multiverse, each arising from different interpretations of existing physical theory. Max Tegmark, a physics professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, has proposed up to 4 separate frameworks within which multiple universes could exist simultaneously. Both physicists have published extensively on the subject in academic contexts, and the broader concept of a multiverse, as a feature of reality rather than a science fiction device, is held by a significant portion of the theoretical physics community as at least plausible, and by some as likely. When the show presents a universe in which infinite parallel realities exist and can be accessed through technology, it is not describing something that physicists regard as obviously impossible. It is describing something that some of them regard as probably true. What the show adds to this premise that the scientific literature does not, and what transforms the multiverse from an interesting cosmological hypothesis into the specific horror the show uses it for, is the portal gun's navigational capability. Rick does not simply know that other realities exist. He can reach them, select them, traverse them at will. Kevork Abazagian, a professor of physics and astronomy at the University of California, Irvine, addressed the specific engineering of the portal gun in an analysis for a popular science publication, and his conclusions were illuminating in ways that clarified how much the show had actually thought through its central technology. The portal fluid, he suggested, would need to contain the energy required to create a traversable wormhole and the exotic matter necessary to stabilize it, preventing the singularity conditions that would make passage through an ordinary wormhole fatal. The green liquid is, therefore, in Abazagian's reading, a concentrated solution of wormhole-stabilizing exotic matter, which is a category of substance that theoretical physics has a name for, even if no laboratory has produced it. The portal gun is not magic in the sense of being disconnected from physics. It is engineering in the sense of requiring physics that does not yet exist, but that does not violate the framework of what physics is trying to describe. The dimension identifier, the C137 designation that places the main characters in a specific reality among infinite others, has its own scientific reference point that the show appears to have built in deliberately. The designation 137 corresponds to the fine structure constant, a dimensionless physical constant with a value of approximately 1 divided by 137 that appears throughout quantum mechanics and electromagnetism. It was identified by physicist Arnold Sommerfeld in 1916 and has since been described by various physicists as one of the most mysterious and fundamental numbers in nature, a quantity whose specific value determines the strength of the electromagnetic interaction and whose origin in the underlying structure of reality remains unexplained. Naming the main character's home dimension C137 is either a coincidence or a choice, and given the show's documented engagement with actual scientific concepts, the choice reading is more plausible. The home reality of the smartest man in the universe is named after the most inexplicable constant in physics. The Cronenberg episode Science, which plays as body horror comedy, is built on premises in virology and molecular biology that are unsettling precisely because they are not entirely implausible. Rick's love serum is keyed to human pheromone and neurochemical responses, which is a real category of biological mechanism. Real scientific literature includes research on compounds that affect pair bonding, sexual attraction, and social behavior in mammals, with the oxytocin system being the most extensively studied. The specific catastrophe of Rick Potion number 9, in which the serum binds to a circulating circulating flu virus and spreads through the global population via respiratory transmission is not a mechanism that current biology can produce, but is not a mechanism that violates the logic of how viruses and biochemical agents interact. Viruses do carry genetic material into host cells and alter cellular behavior. The specific alteration the episode depicts is an extrapolation several orders of magnitude beyond current capability, but the pathway it uses is a recognizable one. The horror works partly because the steps between what is real and what the show depicts are steps, rather than a leap into pure fantasy. The cloning that Rick performs across multiple episodes sits in particularly uncomfortable proximity to real science. Scientists successfully cloned a sheep in 1997, and the technology of reproductive cloning has advanced significantly in the decades since. Researchers have cloned primates, bringing human cloning one step closer. In technical terms, even as the ethical framework surrounding the research has become more restrictive rather than less. The specific capability Rick demonstrates, cloning a full adult human, complete with memories, goes substantially beyond what current science can do. Cloning produces a genetic copy of the original organism, not a copy of their accumulated experience. Memory transfer of the kind the show depicts is a different problem from cloning, and one for which no credible scientific pathway currently exists. But the general capability, creating a biological duplicate of a human being, exists in early form in the real laboratory, and the ethical questions the show uses that capability to raise are questions that real bioethicists are actively arguing about in anticipation of capabilities that may eventually arrive. The microverse raises the most philosophically destabilizing question of all the show's scientific premises, because it is the premise that most directly intersects with the question of what consciousness is and why it matters. If Rick can create a complete miniature universe containing intelligent life, then he has solved, in the show's internal logic, one of the hardest problems in all of science, which is the generation of consciousness from non-conscious matter. The show treats this as an engineering feat, a battery that runs on the labor of beings who do not know they are in a battery. What it does not treat, because treating it would stop the comedy, is the full implication of what it means to create conscious beings for the purpose of exploitation. The philosophical literature on consciousness includes extended arguments about what properties a being must have to possess morally significant experience. Arguments that become very practical very quickly once the creation of artificial consciousness is on the table. If consciousness is substrate independent, meaning it can arise in any sufficiently complex information processing system, regardless of what that system is made of, then the microverse inhabitants are conscious in exactly the same sense that Rick is, experiencing their lives with the same quality of awareness and the same capacity for suffering and meaning. The existence of a boundary between their universe and his does not reduce the significance of that awareness. The fact that their universe was created, rather than naturally arising, does not make the consciousness in it less real. Rick built minds. He built them to serve as a power source. The science that makes this premise coherent is the science that makes it terrible. Dark matter is the show's most casually deployed real scientific concept, and its casualness is part of the joke. Rick uses concentrated dark matter as fuel in the pilot episode, handling a substance that, in real astrophysics, represents one of the most significant unsolved mysteries in the field, accounting for approximately 27% of the universe's total mass energy content and detectable only through its gravitational effects on visible matter, rather than through any direct observation. A physicist theorized in 2009 that a dark matter engine could theoretically be built by collecting particles as a spacecraft moved through space and using their interactions as a propulsion source. The show depicts Rick producing concentrated dark matter in a suburban garage using equipment that fits on a workbench, which is approximately the same distance from real science as depicting someone building a nuclear reactor in a kitchen using a food processor. But the concept has a real scientific address rather than being entirely invented. What the scientific grounding of the show's premises does to the horror is make it harder to dismiss. A purely invented technology in a purely invented universe carries no weight outside the fiction. A technology that is a specific extrapolation of real physics, built on real principles and moving in a direction that real scientists recognize, imports some of the weight of the real into the fictional context. When the show tells the audience that Rick has created a universe of conscious beings and is farming their labor, the horror of that situation is not contained by the genre of animation or the register of comedy, because the question of what consciousness is and what its creation implies is a question that the audience exists inside rather than observes from outside. The microverse inhabitants are a fictional fictional example of a philosophical category that is not fictional at all. The same transfer operates in the other direction. When scientists at Comic-Con panels discussed the show's science with the creative team, as happened at the San Diego Comic-Con with quantum physicist Spiros Michalakis and neuroscientist Crystal Dilworth alongside Harmon and Roiland, the conversation that emerged was notable for how readily the scientists engaged with the show's premises as genuine thought experiments rather than dismissing them as entertainment. Michalakis discussed simulation theory, the proposition that what appears to be base reality might itself be a constructed environment generated by a more fundamental system in connection with the show's microverse premise. The conversation was playful, but not trivial, because the question of whether the universe is itself a simulation, whether there is a hand wrapped around our own sky that we cannot perceive, is a question that serious physicists have written about seriously. Rick's microverse is a fictionalized version of a question that does not have a settled answer. The show's use of memory alteration technology also has a scientific context that the comedy obscures. The neuroscience of memory reconsolidation, the process by which stored memories become temporarily labile when retrieved and can be modified before being restabilized, is an active research area with significant implications for the treatment of trauma and addiction. Experiments in rodents have demonstrated that specific memories can be targeted, weakened, or, in some cases, eliminated through pharmacological intervention during the reconsolidation window. The show's memory erasure device is a dramatic extrapolation of this real mechanism, and the ethical questions the show raises through Rick's use of it, who gets to decide which memories a person carries and which they are permitted to be protected from, are questions that researchers and ethicists working at the edge of real neuroscience are beginning to confront. What the show built, underneath the comedy and the body horror and the interdimensional adventure, is a sustained engagement with the philosophical implications of technologies that are approaching rather than purely imaginary. The portal gun is exotic matter-stabilized wormhole technology. The memory eraser is reconsolidation pharmacology at scale. The cloning is reproductive biology extended to its logical endpoint. The microverse is consciousness engineering as industrial application. Each of these has a real scientific address, and the horror the show generates from each premise is horror that follows from engaging with the real implications rather than stopping at the entertainment surface. The comedy is the delivery mechanism. The science is what gives the horror its weight. The gap between what the show depicts and what science can currently do is a gap of engineering rather than principle, which means the questions the show raises are not questions about a fictional universe, they are questions about this one, arriving slightly ahead of schedule. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The real science showed that the horror underneath the comedy has genuine weight, rooted in premises that physicists and biologists recognize rather than dismiss. Next, the focus moves to the final reckoning. What the show is now, what it lost, what it kept, and what it means that Rick and Morty continues on the other side of everything its own history produced. Section 10. What the show left behind. On October 15th, 2023, Rick and Morty returned to television with new voices and no public acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened. Ian Cardoni opened the 7th season as Rick Sanchez, and Harry Belden opened it as Morty Smith. And the episode that aired was a confident piece of television that knew exactly what kind of show it was, and executed that knowledge without the uncertainty that might have been expected from a production navigating an unprecedented mid-run creative surgery. Critics who had prepared to be forgiving were not required to be. The season that followed was praised as one of the strongest in the show's history. The season after that, the 8th, continued in the same direction. The show that had been built around one man's voice turned out to have been running on something sturdier than that voice for years, and the people who had been supplying that sturdier thing kept supplying it without him. This survival is itself a fact worth sitting with, because it says something specific about what Rick and Morty actually is underneath the mythology that surrounded its creation. The mythology held that the show's distinctive quality was inseparable from Roiland's improvisational vocal performance, the specific texture of two characters talking to themselves in ways that felt spontaneous rather than scripted. That quality was real. The show's rhythm was shaped by it. But the survival of the show's essential character through a complete replacement of both title character voices suggests that what was most valuable in Rick and Morty was never primarily in the performance. It was in the writing, in the structure of the world, in the specific emotional intelligence the show applied to its central relationship, and in the room of writers who had been developing and protecting those qualities across multiple seasons before the collapse of the arrangement that had put Roiland's name on all of it. The academic world had been taking the show seriously for years before any of the real-world events surrounding its creators became public. A peer-reviewed paper paper published in the journal Critical Studies in Television in late 2024, authored by Nicholas Holm and Jenna Lee Donian, treated the show's engagement with nihilism not as a surface quality to be noted and set aside, but as an active philosophical intervention into how nihilism circulates as a social and cultural force. The paper traced the show's changing relationship with its own nihilistic premises across multiple seasons, arguing that the early seasons played with nihilism in a way that was genuinely exploratory, thrilling at the possibilities an infinite and unbounded universe opened up for comedy, and that the later seasons became more self-conscious about the social consequences of popularizing nihilism as a posture, particularly as the third season aired alongside a growing public concern about antisocial behavior in digital spaces and the specific communities that had formed around nihilistic identity performance online. The paper's title was drawn from the translation of Rick's catchphrase, the one his old war companion Bird Person supplies in a first-season episode, Wubba Lubba Dub Dub, rendered into English as, "I am in great pain, please help me." The academic choice to anchor a serious philosophical analysis of the show in that translation was not accidental. The argument embedded in the title is that the show's nihilism was never the whole story, that underneath the comedy and the cosmic indifference and the refusal to be impressed by anything, including existence itself, the show was always also a document of suffering, and that the suffering was the real content, and the nihilism was its armor. This is, broadly, what the show's own later seasons argue explicitly, and the paper's contribution was to trace how that argument developed across the run, and what its relationship to the wider cultural moment was. Other academic work took different angles. Philosophy departments found the show's multiverse premises useful for teaching thought experiments about personal identity, the problem of what makes any particular version of a self the one that matters when infinite alternatives exist simultaneously. Ethics seminars use the microverse for discussions of what obligations arise from the creation of conscious life and whether the intentions of a creator affect the moral status of what they produce. The King Jellybean episode appeared in syllabi examining the relationship between narrative framing and the representation of sexual violence, with attention to how the show's decision to stage the bathroom scene as horror rather than comedy constituted a meaningful formal choice rather than a default. Rick and Morty became, across its run, a show that the academic study of popular culture found genuinely useful, which is a distinction it shares with very few other animated series. What the academic attention established, at the level of cultural record, was that the show's engagement with difficult material was substantive rather than decorative. The nihilism was not merely a marketing position. The examination of toxic relationships was not merely an edgy premise. The show had been building arguments, and the arguments were coherent enough that scholars in multiple disciplines found it worth engaging with them seriously. This matters when considering what remains of the show after everything the record reveals about its origins and its creators, because the quality of the arguments is not dependent on the virtue of the people who develop them. The writing room that produced Dr. Wong's observation about using intelligence to justify sickness produced it regardless of what was happening outside that room. The analysis holds or fails on its own terms. The question of separability, whether the show can be meaningfully engaged with independent of what the available record reveals about Justin Roiland, is one that the show's own thematic preoccupations make unusually complicated to answer. Rick and Morty is a show about what it means that things are not what they appear to be. The central finite curve is a universe that looks like an open infinity, but is actually a curated enclosure. The Citadel looks like a civilization, but is actually a machine for exploitation. Rick looks like a free spirit, but is actually a man running from something specific. The smartest man in the universe looks like a genius and is also a frightened person who used his genius to build walls rather than connections. The show's central intellectual move, repeated at every scale, is to take something that presents one face to the world and turn it around to show what is on the other side. The show was made by people, one of whom built a public persona as a beloved eccentric creator while, according to the NBC investigation, using that persona as a tool for accessing young fans. The persona presented one face. The record suggests another face on the other side. The show's own preoccupation with exactly this structure, with the gap between how things present and what they actually are, does not make the biographical facts more acceptable. But it does create a strange resonance between the work and the circumstances of its production that is difficult to set aside once you have noticed it. The show about surfaces and what lies beneath them was made, in part, by someone whose own surface concealed something the show's own thematic logic would would have recognized immediately. This resonance does not resolve into a comfortable reading. It does not mean the show knew what it was doing biographically or was commenting on its own creator's conduct, which would require a self-awareness and intentionality about the connection that there is no evidence for. It means that the show's central analytical framework is the framework that applies most directly to the situation its own creation produced, which is either a profound irony or simply the ordinary condition of art made by complicated people, where the work's intelligence is real and the maker's conduct is separate, and both facts coexist without either canceling the other. The show's own most mature position on this kind of coexistence is articulated in the Citadel material, where the audience is asked to hold two things simultaneously. The Citadel is a real civilization with real inhabitants who experience genuine lives inside it, and the Citadel was built on systematic exploitation that the show does not excuse by virtue of how interesting the civilization turned out to be. The microverse is real to its inhabitants, and it is a battery. Simple Rick's happiness is genuine, and it is being farmed. The show keeps refusing to let either half of these doubled truths dissolve the other, because its argument about reality is precisely that both halves are always present and that the ability to hold both is what genuine understanding requires. Applied to the show itself, this framework suggests something like the following. Rick and Morty is a genuinely intelligent piece of television that develops sophisticated arguments about power, exploitation, and the cost of brilliant avoidance. Arguments that hold on their own terms and that academic analysis has engaged with seriously. It was also made by people whose conduct, by the available record, exhibited some of the patterns the show most carefully examined. Both of these things are true. The show's quality does not excuse the conduct. The conduct does not retroactively hollow out the quality. The audience that continues watching after knowing everything the record contains is not making a simple choice, but a complicated one. And the show's own thematic framework is, appropriately, the most honest guide available for making it. Where the show goes from here is a question that the available evidence suggests will be answered on its own terms. The creative team that kept Rick and Morty functional through the removal of its co-creator's voice, through the recasting of both title characters, and through the public processing of everything the news cycle produced about the show's origins and the people behind it, is the same creative team that has been developing the show's most ambitious material for multiple seasons. The 8th season has continued the long narrative threads established in the 7th. The Citadel's aftermath, the Smith family's ongoing reconfiguration, the show's deepening interest in what Morty has become after all these years. The writing has remained at the level the audience came to expect, which is a higher level than most television operating in the same register attempts. The nihilism that academic researchers identified as the show's central philosophical preoccupation has, across the later seasons, been significantly complicated by the show's own growing interest in what remains after nihilism has said everything it has to say. The Rick who declares in the 3rd season finale that nothing matters and no one is special, and that this is happening infinite times across infinite realities, is the same Rick who, in later seasons, accepts a grandson's hug in a parking lot after killing the person he spent a lifetime hunting, and who keeps returning to the same family and the same reality in defiance of a philosophy that tells him there is no reason to prefer any particular configuration of anything. The show has spent its later seasons documenting the failure of nihilism as a livable position, which is different from abandoning the insight that prompted it. The infinite multiverse is real. Nothing in it is cosmically significant, and people keep mattering to each other anyway, locally and stubbornly and against the logic of the scale. This is, finally, what the show left behind that is worth keeping. Not the chaos of the Szechuan sauce riots, not the harassment of the writer's room, not the biographical record of the people who made it. What it left behind is a sustained argument built across 8 seasons of genuine craft that the gap between what things appear to be and what they are is not a reason for despair, but an occasion for honesty. That the people who matter to you, regardless of what the multiverse says about the statistical significance of their existence. And that the highest form of intelligence available to a person is not the kind that builds walls against feeling, but the kind that stays present anyway. The show made that argument in the voice of a drunk old man who spent most of the run refusing to take his own advice, which is exactly the right voice for it. Because the argument is not about people who already know how to do the thing. It is about the distance between knowing and doing, and what that distance costs, and what might be recovered by closing it, even partially. Rick and Morty was made by imperfect people working in a broken industry, producing an imperfect imperfect product that was also, at its best moments, genuine and true. That description applies to most of the art worth keeping. The record of how it was made is now substantially public, and the audience that continues watching does so knowing that record. The show they are watching is asking them, in every episode, to look at what is actually there rather than at the surface, to hold complicated truths without resolving them prematurely, and to understand that something being real and something being painful are not mutually exclusive conditions. The show earned the right to ask that, not because the people who made it lived up to it, but because the argument itself is sound. That is what the show left behind. That is what remains. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.